is really nice because then you can explore more freely. And I feel like you say unburdened, and like that word really resonates for people who are coming in, and they're like, they don't have all these like existing physics in their heads that are kind of not super applicable, right? Like it feels like we've learned the physics, but now we're on the moon.
Yeah.
And like they're still applicable, but they're like also wrong.
Yeah. Hey, Luca here. Welcome to a new episode of the Refactoring podcast, where every 2 weeks we interview a world-class tech leader. Today's guest is Amelia Wattenberger, former principal research engineer at GitHub and now partner at Sutter Hill Ventures. But she's also a product lead at Augment Code, where she developed Intent, a developer workspace for orchestrating AI coding agents and delivering complex work. So this is a fascinating chat into the future and the present of software development with someone who has clearly been at the very frontier of this for many years. So let's dive into the action. Welcome, Amelia, and thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Luca.
So, Amelia, you are a project lead at Augment Code for Intent. And before that, you've also been a principal research engineer on the GitHub Next team. So I think it's safe to say you've been investigating the future of software development for a while now. Am I right? Would that be correct?
That would be correct. Yeah, a while, maybe since 2021, 2022.
Yeah, before the whole AI wave, before it was cool, let's say.
Before it was crazy.
Yeah, exactly. Before it was crazy. I love it. So one of the main reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast is that I've been using Intent myself for a few weeks, and I love the UX. I love how opinionated it is. And then our mutual friend Emma told me you were kind of the mastermind behind it. Is that right?
If you had told me a few years ago that I would have tried to rebuild the IDE, I would think you were lying, right? It's like a ridiculous thing to try to do. And one of the amazing things about AI these days is one person can do a lot. And I definitely wasn't the only person working on it, but a lot of the prototyping and like spiritual exploration comes from my frustrations and thinkings of how can we change things over the last I don't know, however long I've been coding, 15 years or something.
Yeah, it's just incredible how much leverage it feels we have as individuals these days, even to go after things that feel kind of sacred. Like you said, the IDE, right? Been like the same since like forever. And so I'd love to chat about so many things, from Intent itself to how you have thought about this and designed it, and then maybe go a bit beyond and talk about where you think the developer process is going and so on. So first of all, how would you even define Intent to provide a little bit more context to listeners and to people who are not familiar with that?
Yeah, so Intent is our take on what comes after the IDE. Like you were saying, the IDE has been around for like almost half a century. And they're wonderful, but every single pixel is devoted to reading and understanding code. And it feels like as agents get better and better at the nitty-gritty of reading and understanding the code, our role as developers has changed, where we're working more at higher levels of abstraction, where we have more leverage, and we kind of like hacked things into our existing primitives. We're like, okay, chat in the IDE or chat on the command line. Like, where else can we put chat? Right, chat on GitHub. And we're still trying to leverage, like, okay, we just throw it in the IDE, but like there's no way to go up and down that ladder of abstraction easily, or like what does it look like when we spend more time focusing on our plan and the intent behind the plan. So that it's like an exploration of what does the interface look like when we're spending more time at that higher leverage place. And it's been really fun exploring and like there's a lot of like frustrations that I've had trying to use these new AI tools where like orchestrating agents is really hard because you don't know what each agent is doing. And a lot of the trick is to get the right context for the right agent at the right time.
Yeah.
And like a lot of that feels really manual right now. And they're kind of just working on their own and they're not like synced together. There's like not proper collaboration or communication between you and the agents. So it's been a good exploration of like, how do we solve these problems in a way that like doesn't freeze things in time because things keep changing, right? Like how do we design a product where it keeps evolving with the space?
Yeah. And so to get a bit practical, intent for those who have not seen it, it's like, I can call it a developer workspace, something like that, where agents, when you coordinate agents and there are separate workspaces that are isolated, there's a strong focus on specs. So there are a few elements that to me look very opinionated. It's like the tool says, you should be working like that, right? So where does this, first of all, what are the strong opinions, if I'm right, that you infused them into the tool, and how did you come to this?
Yeah. This has been a tension in designing, like, what is the shape of the product? So the core of the product is the new primitive is a workspace. It's not an agent chat. And for any given piece of work that you want to do, you just spin up a new workspace, and a workspace includes an isolated copy of your code base with a branch and a Git work tree, a set of agents, a set of rich markdown notes that don't get checked into the code base, and they each have a spec that they're started with. So like a place to put the plan and for everyone to see it and collaborate on it, like terminals, like anything to do with looking at the work is kind of just bundled together. So I'd say that's like the most opinionated part of it, is like we just need a membrane around a given task, and then we can switch between tasks really quickly or do like 3 at once if the agents are taking a while on one. And we're not like switching Git branches and remembering like, where's that, like what am I doing again in this feature, or like what was that conversation I had again. So that's something that I felt like we needed a new primitive for, as we're working faster and faster and working across more and more features and projects. And then the really interesting thing for me that's come out of working on this is how applications are changing and how we should differently design things, where like back in the day, we used image maps for websites, right? And like you made an image and then you sliced it up and you're like, all right, we're good. This looks cool.
Times,
I kind of miss those times. But then we're like, wait, the web's dynamic and like screen sizes are dynamic. So we need to design for different sizes of screens and for the content to change on the screen for different people. And it feels like we're just adding another dynamic dimension where like the behavior gets to change. So a lot of the product has been about getting the right primitives in there and then adding these sane defaults in the way of the prompts to the agents. So we have like personas, we call them specialists. And by default, the app starts with like a coordinator specialist that delegates to implementers and verifier specialists. But this is all tweakable. So whenever someone comes and they're like, I don't like that the implementers work at the same time, or like, I don't like the verifier. I wish it did more of like the implementers did more of like a TDD type style. It's a very easy answer because you say, go to the settings and tweak, like just like say how you want it to work. And the entire behavior of the app is different. In this really amazing way.
It's incredible because it feels like we're just figuring out things on the go about how we can work with this new technology. And you mentioned different agents and different personas. For example, something that I think it's not clear to many people is when and how and why you should split separate agent personas to do different things. as opposed to, for example, you just use your CLI tool agent to do the whole distance, from the planning to actually reviewing and testing and doing QA to the code. Have you found that splitting personas, giving more specific tasks, as you've done in the default personas on intent, leads to better results, for example?
Yeah. There's a few pieces there. I know there has been research saying that more focused agents leads to like more accurate results. And like there's all these interesting orchestration frameworks that I'm really excited to dive into more. But just observationally, having one agent thread per task has been really nice as far as keeping them on track and having them do exactly the thing that you want them to do and nothing more. And also like letting them work in parallel, right? Like when you have one agent thread, it's synchronous, so everything like has to happen linearly. But when you split it up, then you have like, you can have 10 agents working at once if you can parallelize the work, which it's always nice when things move more quickly. But I do think they stay on task. So there's like the prompt that the agents are given and the fact that they're isolated and they're only working on like one level of abstraction at a time. Like the coordinator is like higher level and the implementers are like, I'm only doing this one thing, which I find works quite well. And then the other really interesting thing is we have bring your own agent. So you can use Cloud Code, you can use Codex, you can use Open Code, you can use Augment's Augie. And there's a lot of really interesting explorations around which agent and which model is best at different tasks. So you could have like the coordinator be Opus, like this nice, like kind of friendly, warm personality that's good at like thinking high level. And then for like the implementers, you could have Codex, which is like a very like, I'm going to get the work done and like, we're not going to chat about it. Type agent.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So let's say the mental model could be, you said there is research that if you give agents a very well-defined scope, they're going to perform better because it's less stuff to remember, just like people anyway. And so the mental model for you could be, if these tasks have no overlap, they can be sequential and they can be parallelized, then it's just better to spin up different personas, different agents to do the thing. It's cleaner and it also leads to better outcome.
Yeah. Faster, cleaner, feels more powerful.
Makes a lot of sense. And one thing that really stuck with me when I used intent for the first time is how focused it is on the spec part of the project, but in a way that feels different from what you hear these days with spec-driven development, for example, right? You said the specs are not getting into the version control, they are constantly updated between you and the agent. So it's more like living spec, something that feels different from the kind of waterfall-ish approach. You do this, you do the full spec, you hand it off to the agent, and then it does the work. Am I right?
Yeah, it is a little bit different, especially because I think the biggest downfall of spec-driven development is the usual workflow is you have an agent write a spec and then you sign off on it, and then like that's the beginning of the conversation, and then the agents work from that. Which is really nice because then you can focus, like you can have the agent extrapolate from like dark mode. It's like, what does that actually mean? And how would that work in this code base? And you have this like nice write-up and you can look through it and get alignment with the agent before the work gets done. But then once the work starts getting done, oftentimes that spec becomes obsolete. Whereas I think it's a very different way of working where you treat the spec like the place you steer the agents from and where you check in on the progress. So because we have our own app and we're not just working in like normal markdown files, we get to add new affordances like subtasks within the spec. So when the spec's created, it's the agent will typically split the work into chunks. I think in the default prompt, we say split it into chunks that would take about 30 minutes because agents always overestimate how long a task will take. usually like a 30-minute task will take a few minutes.
That's classic. Yeah, doesn't happen with humans. That's one thing in which AI is different remarkably from what human developers do.
Yeah. And they all have these different estimations. It's really a weird world we live in. But then, like, once you're looking at the spec, once the tasks start getting delegated, you know the status of every single piece of work, because the delegated agent treats that subtask as their like main way of communicating with the user and their main way of like keeping up to date and figuring out what it is that they're working on. So you can click into those subtasks and see what the agent reported and click into the specific code changes for that subtask. So there's just like a lot of really rich ways to treat the spec as the control plane, which changes the relationship where when I have to go back to the only surface like is the agent chat, it feels like you're trying to understand a code base based on the commit log.
Yeah.
Right? Like the chat is a change log, but like what I want to know is like the general state of the thing that we're working on. So it's been really generative in that way.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. And with respect to the kind of top-down approach of creating detailed specs beforehand, and use them throughout the whole process. What I found is that being the coding part cheaper and faster, it feels a better approach to just have agents make some progress, even if the spec is not fully, formed in my head about what I want to achieve in terms of a feature, in terms of the UX, and then steer from that part and then we'll get to a final spec, for example, whatever final means. But but instead, if I stop and say I need the whole thing in detail beforehand, I think it's based on the old assumption that if we build the wrong thing, it's going to be very expensive to rectify, right? And it feels like it's not the case anymore.
It is interesting, like the value that we place on code and code changes. I'm continuously correcting myself where like I spin up an agent, it makes like 2,000 lines change, and I'm like, am I just gonna throw this away? Like if it's 80% there, it's hard to think. It's like, okay, well that's good enough, like let's just ship it. And constantly I'm like, wait, we learned something and now let's go back to the beginning and redo it based on like this cleaner like set of assumptions and steering. But like it feels so wasteful
it's
coming from
it's true.
A long time of code being very valuable.
I think your brain has to be rewired all the time. I mean, the example you made, like add dark mode, right? I think there's also on your website, and the prompt is literally add dark mode, right? Which you would never say that to a developer just like that, right? You would create, the full detail of how the various shades should look like. But now it feels like, okay, let's have the agents have a first pass and see what they do, and that informs your taste of what you would like it to look like in the end, and it feels more efficient for maybe your personal workflow, but extremely wasteful if you look at it from the perspective of coding. Yeah,
that's really interesting. I think of these LLMs as like they're a way to draw the assumptions out of statements that we make, right? Like when I say add dark mode, like behind each one of those words is like 1,000 other words. And typically, if that's like, okay, that's the feature, then you sit down and like you were saying, you're like, okay, what's dark? What's mode? Like which pages am I applying? Where's the toggle go? And it feels really nice to do a different kind of work, which is like pointing at something and saying how it's wrong. Right? Like instead of sitting and extrapolating yourself, you get to see like maybe here's like option 1, option 2, and like it's easy to be like option 2 is clearly better, as opposed to like thinking through all the options in your head and then writing that down.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, now that you say that, I think there is something about the cognitive load that of having to create the thing from scratch, this act of creation of the full spec, as opposed to looking at alternatives and just pointing your finger and maybe, correcting a few things and being able to say, oh yeah, that's how I want it, or I want it just slightly different. But it feels infinitely easier than just doing the full thing out of thin air.
It's funny hearing you say that. Makes me draw an analogy to, like, I think smart defaults are so nice, and just like plopping someone in the middle lets them work from like a place of decisions rather than a place of generation.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of what we're doing with the default specialist prompts, where there's like a new app a day, and like there's skills, and like, oh my God, there's all these things that I need to learn. And like, imagine, like, I've been paying attention for years, but I can imagine being a developer who's like, I now need to pay attention to AI.
Yeah.
Like, I don't even know where they would start.
Yeah.
And it would just be like a really long journey figuring out a workflow that works for them.
Yeah.
And so part of what I'm trying to do with the app is ship something that has these smart defaults.
Yeah.
And then they can decide, hey, I don't like this part. And like, they're already somewhere where they're getting like a supercharged workflow that they can then tweak.
Yeah.
And they're not starting from the beginning, figuring out every single piece along the way. So hopefully it's a nice way for people to start paying attention to AI and not having to learn every single thing before they
I think it is. Definitely it is. And I think it's especially important whenever we have new tech, new workflows. And I mean, today everything feels kind of up for grabs. And so I think new tools to succeed, but to be more useful in general, also need to educate people, right, and developers on what good looks like on a basic level, because otherwise it's daunting. I mean, we used to say that Cloud Code or any CLI tool is like simpler than like a full-blown IDE, but when you think about it, you open up a terminal, there's just a text box. You can work with it in any way you can think of. And there are ways that are probably 10 to 100x more effective than others. And it's not trivial for anyone.
Yeah, I remember many years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I had a blog post called like "Chatbots Are Not the Future."
Yeah.
And just saying similar things, right? Like when you have a chat box, there's nothing pointing you towards success, right?
Yeah.
You kind of just have to try things and learn on your own what works and what doesn't, as opposed to interfaces which kind of nudge you in certain directions. And like someone posted on Hacker News, right? And it just got all this comments like, natural language is the most natural interface. Like, this is the ultimate interface. And it's like, I still just can't believe the like confidence behind those statements of like, it seems a lot like the CLI, right? Where everything's possible, but nothing is like polished, right? Jack of all trades, master of none.
Yeah.
You could do anything, but like that also means everything has a little bit of friction and a little bit of a learning curve.
It's kind of, I mean, another analogy might be touch screens in cars as opposed to physical interfaces, that everything is possible, but it's slightly more inconvenient and it doesn't properly inform you of what you can do or what you should do.
Well, I was going to say, I think a lot about phones these days. And like when I was growing up, right, you get like a phone that does this. There's like a phone that does this, and like things were wacky.
Yes, totally.
And like every time there's a new phone, you're like, what crazy stuff are they doing this time?
Totally.
And now it's just like these touch screens, which can do everything, right? But like it was funny to hear you say like intent is more of an opinionated tool, because I've been saying for years, like, can we just have opinions, right? Like everyone's kind of just copying each other and doing like, what's the like obvious next thing? And it just feels like let's get weird. Let's like, there's a huge space of exploration for like, how do we write code with these ridiculous, like fuzzy machines?
It's incredible.
And
I think there is so much space for opinions right now. I mean, more than it ever felt to me in the past, like 15 years about the development process and everything. I think it's also interesting to explore or where these opinions should be. I mean, how much these opinions should be embedded into products and where they should end, right? You talk about smart defaults. I mean, what's the frontier, where these defaults end and then people can customize? For example, I think there are great abstractions in intent about the agents, and I think everybody understands what, a coordinator is, verifier is, specialists, and these are like abstractions, and then you can tweak and plug what a verifier means for you, for your tech stack, or for you how you want to work, and what your specialists should be. So that to me, that's an example of an opinion that feels easy to understand, but also easy to be tweaked if you need something slightly different.
yeah, there's one other. So the spirit has been like, add a few new primitives, not too many, that are like massively flexible and give you smart defaults. And one of the ones that is kind of unexplored right now is the note system. So you have these rich markdown notes, and we start you with a spec, and there's some really nice affordances there. But I'm also really excited about just like using them as a place for collaboration and for communication. Like, I've been playing with like a guide specialist that will write a whole note that uses, like, we have our own built-in diagramming system where you can step through different states, and like, can it construct like a really nice note digest of like, how does this structure work? Like, how does the task work, right? Like, let's go through this PR. Like, what are the things I should be paying attention to? And like, I think AMP or somebody, Windsurf maybe, they shipped like a really nice like code map, walk me through this code base. And the paradigm shift feels like, instead of having that, if we have this note system where you can build basically that exact same UI, but now users can tweak it. They're like, I don't want, like, typically I want you to break it into like six sections instead of 10, or like, I want you to write like a little summary in between each of these sections. Like, it feels like we have, once you put it into a system where it's tweakable and it's customizable and it's building off these rich primitives, like, you can build a lot of these same like wonderful interfaces, but in a way that the user has a lot more control over it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's just so much space for exploring this type of, as you call them, primitives and different ways of working. Also makes me wonder, and maybe you can even speak from your experience at Augment, whether when you look at how engineers work and product people work in a product development team, are you seeing that they're just getting faster at what they do? Or some things are so cheaper and faster, so different, that also the scope of what people do is different. Some people are more autonomous. They go after things that they just didn't do at all before. How has that changed how you work in the team?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think the first thing that jumps out to me is it's kind of just a multiplier. So for the people who are really self-directed, especially for like junior developers, it's like a massive force multiplier for junior developers who are really self-directed and like motivated to learn new things and try to apply it, and like are constantly trying to push the edge. And I think some other people at the same time might be more floundering, where they're like, maybe they're leaning more into the agents for writing the code, but not actually learning from it, or trying to build systems where they feel in control. They're just, vibe coding, quote unquote, their work, and like nobody's the richer for it, and maybe they're not faster because then you have to do the maintenance afterwards. And I think it feels very dependent on the person to become a master of the tools, as opposed to the easy, like, become a consumer of code being written by the agents. I don't know. I'm curious what your experience is.
I think it's interesting that you said it pretty much depends on the person. because it feels to me that the way you said that is not much dependent on the skills of the person, but more like on their attitude, on their mindset, how they approach the tools. Is that correct?
Yeah. And like trajectory is very important. Like if I catch up with a friend from high school, this is a very random tangent, but like if I think about the people I was friends with in high school, it was a long time ago. Like the trajectory and like whether they're like in an upward spiral where they learn from things and they have the right attitude versus like a downward spiral, like we've ended up in very different places. And the only thing it comes down to, like, it doesn't matter where they started. The only thing it is like, do they have the tools and the attitude to go in the direction that they prefer, or do they get in this weird downward spiral? So it's just something that kind of stands out to me. And if you think of like junior engineers, the direction, like being able to learn from things and being like a master of your own destiny type stuff, it seems very important. And you introduce AI and that just like multiplies it, by 10 or whatever.
And so I don't want to evade your questions. You asked me what I think about it, but before that, I wanted to ask this. When I asked you this question, the first thing that you mentioned is junior engineers, and what you said, this is a big multiplier, and for example, for junior engineers, this and that, and this kind of counters one of the narratives these days that junior engineers are going to get in trouble. So you're telling me they're not doomed at all.
I think the opposite. Like, I think now is such an interesting time. And I think the change in attitude it's not about learning the tools. And honestly, it never has been. Right? Like if people, when they apply to a position, they're like, I know, Svelte, right? I know Angular, I know React. Like that's not, like as having been on the other side of that, that's not typically what I'm looking for. I'm looking for like, do they understand the systems that they built and how do they talk about it? And it feels like a little bit of the same paradigm where if they're just constantly learning, not the tools or the syntax, but learning like new workflows and how systems should be architected. It feels like an amazing time to learn all this. Like I remember when I first learned to code, I learned on Code Academy, and then it was in this nice sandbox. And then it's like, all right, you have to host your website. It was just like, how do I do that? I don't know. And it was like way more painful to just host a simple website than even learning how to program in the first place. And like, if you think about now, right, you just like type it in the box and it tells you, oh, go over here and do this, right? Like it's like, there's so much time that I spent back then doing things that would be almost instant right now.
I think I agree anyway that this story about junior engineers being in trouble, I think it's a little bit simplistic, to say the least. And because I understand the argument that to understand and steer these tools, you may need some of the senior skills, right? Otherwise, how are you able to judge and so on? But I also think, I know on one end, junior engineers learn very fast. Smart people always learn faster than we kind of account for. And they're also unburdened by a lot of things that instead they don't need to use, apply, and learn anymore. That instead senior engineers might have biases, about. I think it's a double-edged sword. And it's not clear who's going to benefit the most or the least from this.
Yeah, I think about like as someone who writes code and designs, oftentimes you want a design tool because you don't have to consider the medium that you're gonna ultimately build it in. Right? Like it seems silly, but like being able to drag things around in a way that's unnatural for the end medium is really nice, because then you can explore more freely. And I feel like you say unburdened, and like that word really resonates for people who are coming in and they're like, they don't have all these like existing physics in their heads that are kind of not super applicable, right? Like it feels like we've learned the physics, but now we're on the moon.
Yeah.
And like, they're still applicable, but they're like also wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I think junior engineers will grow in ways we don't expect. And we learn things that we don't expect and don't learn things that we also don't expect. So maybe if we are able to look at the shape of what a junior engineer learns and knows, we might look at that and see, oh, how's that possible? The one does engineering by knowing this and not knowing that. But I'm also optimistic that, the learning takes the shape of the environment, of the workflow flow, of what needs to be done. So I think we'll just figure it out. And when it comes to your question, that is how you're thinking about, how I'm thinking about the roles that are changing. I think engineers are going to thrive. They can thrive, but they also need to embrace the fact that their job is changing, and in many ways it's more similar to that of a manager, or of one who is able to control the flow of work in a way that is clean, that is well done, as opposed to being a micromanager of the AI code or of the code itself. And I think it's hard for many people, because if we keep the analogy of becoming a manager, many engineers just want to be managers. And so it's they love the craft, so I empathize with that. So to go back to what you said before, I think mindset and how you approach it on a psychological level makes a lot of difference.
Yeah, the craft word is interesting, right? Because you can kind of bifurcate, or like there's two really big joys for programming from my perspective. One is like the craft of the code, right? Like I've spent a long time learning how code works, and I have these tools in my belt, and I get to like apply them and get in a flow state. And then there's just like thinking of something in your head and then it exists.
Yes.
Which like I could never get enough of. And they're both craft. And like I think it's just a matter of like, what is the medium through which you're learning the craft? And I think that is changing, where like writing the perfect code, just like when Prettier came along, right? We stopped talking about like tabs for spaces and number of spaces for alignment, right? And like that didn't change the fact that we were still craftsmen. It just changed what we were talking about. One other question I have for you.
Go.
Is okay, so you're talking about a lot of how we're gonna work is similar to being a manager and being a tech lead, right? And like one question is like, what are things that you can learn from being an effective manager that you can apply to working with the agents? And my second follow-up question is, how might we be over-indexing on how human managers work and agents are actually a little bit different? So how might it be a little bit different in practice?
These are such tough questions. So I think one of the main skills for being a good manager that translates well into working with AI is the attitude that you need to continuously kind of replace yourself and like bottle your taste and your judgment into procedures, instructions, rules that are clear, so that you can delegate work and make work be high quality in a way that is reliable. And if you're used to do that, if you're used to think my output is not the output of what I actually do, my output is being able to take stuff out of my head and train people that are around me, then I think you're going to have a great time with agents, because not only that's exactly how you work with them, but you can also work with them with a feedback loop that is infinitely, tighter and faster than what you can do with humans to whom you can just give 100 pieces of feedback a day. So I think that translates well. Things that don't translate well, one of them is something that I also told you before. I mean, it's still not clear to me what are the boundaries for which we should think at separate agents versus an agent that does many things. I think right now we kind of have this bias that maybe is correct, that an agent has this scope that is similar to a person, and does this or does that. But maybe we should split things, orchestrate things differently. I don't know, but it's super early days. So it's very hard to say.
Yeah, it is interesting. Like there's all these new types of like ways you could orchestrate agents.
Yeah.
Like one thing I've been really wanting to explore is like you have a team of 2.
Yeah.
And they take turns where like agent A takes a stab and then agent B comes out and they critique that and then they improve it and like they go back and forth. And what if they're different models, so they have slightly different personalities?
Yeah.
Like times 100, right? There's all these new ways of like maybe things are more graphical instead of hierarchical, and like maybe there's like a panel of experts that are like different modeled after different UI designers, and like whenever you need a new feature you send it to this panel.
Yeah.
And then there's like a coordinator for the panel where everyone on the panel has an opinion, and then they get sent to the coordinator and they pick the best one, or they like take the best out of all of them, or maybe they go back for a second where they critique each other.
Yeah.
And like it seems like we need the tools to make it easy to explore different paradigms, because it's just so hard to, it's like very much a research question of like, I need to focus really hard to like figure out what each agent is doing. And like, I don't have a graphical representation of what everyone is doing. So I'm hoping intent is a good place for these explorations, because like we can build, you know, a graph. We have a graph behind a secret shortcut right now where you can see how the agents are orchestrating.
I think your take is smart in the fact that we may not know the answer to many of these, right? But what we can do is to create an environment for yourself where it's super easy and fast to experiment, right? That's the best we can do. And then we'll eventually find solutions.
Yeah. And how is that different than companies? Maybe we should, there's that webcomic where it had the different companies' structures. And I think Microsoft is just everyone pointing a gun at you. But like, what if we just went and mimicked each of those for doing a task?
Yeah, and see who wins.
How would that turn out?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Another question I had is, we always talk about coding and actual software engineering when it comes to agents and AI. But I mean, product development includes a lot of different work about product, about design, about QA and other things. So have you seen agents impact how these other areas that are adjacent to coding and engineering, how these areas work?
Yeah. Actually, yesterday, so I work at Sutter Hill, which is one of the investors in Augment, and we have like a small in-house team of people who are very good at various things. And some of the people on the team are designers, and they come from, you know, like Apple and like design tools typically, and they're not developers at all. And actually, yesterday we onboarded them onto Intent, and like we still have to onboard them because the product wasn't designed for designers, right? Like we talk about Git, right? And like these are things that are intimidating when you're learning like 10 new things at once. But like one of them has made like 10 commits and already has code in production, right? Like it's amazing given the right harness, so that you can, like one of the first concerns was like, what if I make a mess? Right. And it's like, you're in a sandbox. You can do whatever you want and it will not affect anything until you press this button or until you make a PR and someone else reviews it. So like given a place to play around, and like the guide, which is like maybe your coordinator agent, you're like, oh, I don't like this. How can I change it? And like they tell you, right? Like this is like an amazing sandbox for learning essentially how to write code. And like you can make it as educational as you want, right? You can say like, wait, walk me through what you just did. So I learned the fundamentals, but it's like, I think anyone who's not already a developer, like it's a really golden time to learn the principles of how software is built.
Yeah. So basically, in your example, if you're a designer, there will be many situations in which it's more worth to create a working prototype or a stub of a feature as opposed to just creating the design and hand it off to developers. They can just go into Intent or any of these agentic tools and try to translate their intent, like pun intended, into a working thing and they hand off the working thing as opposed to the static Figma design.
I keep thinking about like we used to have this separation of concerns for like websites where HTML would be in one place, CSS is in another file, JavaScript is in another file, right? We have like button.css, button.javascript, and button.html.
Yeah.
But like modern JavaScript frameworks they're like, why don't we just put those in one place? Because like the way you think about it is like, this is the button, and like the styles and the structure and the logic are all kind of intertwined. So let's slice things horizontally instead of vertically.
Yeah.
And it seems like we might be doing the same thing with job roles where you're not a designer, you're not a developer, you're just somebody building a feature.
Yeah. That's a very interesting take. Yeah.
It's a weird world that we're going into.
But so the natural question becomes, is what's the space for deep specialists in this kind of workflow, right? I mean, the designer with 15 years of experience who is like super expert in UX, UI, does that feel like a waste for them to work as a generalist that create feature prototypes, or not necessarily a waste for them, but a waste in the process? I don't know how to frame that. How we take advantage of the deep expertise of people in the various layers of the stack.
I feel like people will start specializing more in like areas, if that makes sense, right? Like instead of I'm a JavaScript developer, right? It becomes I'm a web developer, or I focus on like dashboard apps, or, like I only do things around like the plumbing industry. I don't know. Like, I wish I had a good analogy off the top of my head of like, fishermen, like once you can fit the whole process into one person, how do people specialize? And I'm guessing, I don't know anything about fish or how to get them. I just like to eat them. Like I'm guessing like, you focus on a specific type of fish, or like, I'm out of my depth here.
No,
but I'm sure there's a good analogy.
But I think what we are saying is that domain, I mean, when the rest of the technology fits in a smaller like cognitive space, maybe domain knowledge, product domain knowledge becomes more important. And we may actually see specialization that did not make sense before, like, finance dashboard, product tech specialist, that, I mean, this is a completely transversal specialization that could not exist. As in your example, we were slicing things in a direction, now we are slicing things in a different direction.
That's a really much better way to put it.
I'm not sure, but thank you. Yeah.
So it also makes me think of like my progression as like through my career, right? I started as a front-end developer, and I've been moving more and more towards design and kind of like spreading out, and I like prototype, which means design and development and product thinking and thinking about the company as a whole. And it makes me wonder if people will be more in tune with like what is it that they're building and what is it that the company's building and what does the company stand for. Because like in the old way of working, you're like a JavaScript developer, right? And your task is to make the JavaScript good. And you have a list of tasks that you get through, and you do like one task a day, and like there's not really brain space to think about why are we building this, or like how does this fit into like our goals as a company. And maybe if we're more focused on what is it that we're building and why, maybe people will think more about things at a higher level, but I don't know. What do you think?
No, I think it's a good idea of a direction that we may go towards. And I think, I mean, you briefly touched on this, and we haven't talked about this a lot, but you might be, if you think of your trajectory, a good example of this slicing that happens differently. You said you also work in the fund that invested in Augment, right? So it's like your expertise is like transversal. You've worked in UX and the future of software development, and that has, allowed you maybe to touch on different things that otherwise wouldn't be necessarily connected, right? And so we might see more of that. And by the way, I think I'm thinking about my past startup experience. I would be very happy if an investor of mine just came one day and said, I have an idea for a product. Can I build it for you and let's go? I don't think many investors do that.
Yeah, the thing I worry about is your reaction is very dependent on whether or not you like the product.
Yes.
That might be more annoying if you don't like the prototype.
Yeah, it's a very activist investor.
Yeah, for better or worse.
For better or worse, yeah. This time for better, but who knows?
Because I've been on the other side too, and it's either a blessing or a curse.
Yeah. That's great. So Amelia, thank you so much for this awesome chat. I loved it, and let's stay in touch about the future of development, and let's exchange more ideas in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much, Luca. This was fun.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this chat valuable, you can subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find the show. You can find all past episodes and learn more about the show at refactoring.fm. See you in the next episode.